The Gilded Cage, a sleepy night among America's new royalty. Hey friends, tonight we're pulling back the brocade drapes and tiptoeing into an era so drenched in gold leaf, it practically glows in the dark. Welcome to the Gilded Age, that stretch of American history when a man could make more money in a single railroad deal than his grandfather saw in a lifetime. And the first thing he'd do with it was buy a house with more rooms than his entire hometown. This isn't a story about quiet wealth. This is a story about chandeliers the size of carriages, dinners with 14 courses, and families who competed with each other the way other people compete in wars, except with more marble. Before you sink into your pillow, if you're the kind of person who enjoys drifting off to the sound of somebody else's absurd problems, go ahead and hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are, and whether your bathtub is porcelain, cast iron, or, if you're truly living the dream tonight, nothing fancier than a shower curtain that won't stay closed. No judgment either way. Now dim the lights, let your fan hum along like a very expensive butler who never speaks, and get yourself comfortable. Because tonight, you're not you anymore. Tonight, you've just opened your eyes in the autumn of 1887, in a townhouse on the east side of Manhattan, and you have absolutely no idea how you got so rich or where you left your other cufflink. Waking up wealthy. The first thing you notice isn't the light. It's the silence, a very specific, very expensive kind of silence, the kind that costs a household staff of 11 to maintain. Somewhere below you, a kettle is already whistling, though you'll never actually hear it, because whoever is minding it has strict instructions to remove it from the stove before the sound could possibly reach your ears and disturb your delicate constitution. Your ceiling is painted with a scene of clouds and cherubs so ambitious it looks like someone hired the Sistine Chapel's second cousin. Sunlight filters through curtains so heavy they could double as ship sails, dyed the exact shade of blue your decorator assured you was the only acceptable blue this season. You stretch beneath a quilt stuffed with goose down harvested, you're fairly sure, from geese who lived better lives than most factory workers 3 blocks away, though you try not to think about that part too hard. A soft knock. Your lady's maid, let's call her Constance, because every household seems to have exactly one, enters without waiting for a reply, since waiting for a reply would suggest you might say no, and no is not a word that gets much use in this house. She's already carrying a tray, hot chocolate thick enough to stand a spoon in, and a small dish of candied ginger, because apparently mornings require a snack before the actual meal arrives. You sit up. Your feet, without any effort on your part, land squarely inside a pair of slippers that have somehow been warmed by the fireplace and placed at precisely the correct angle. You didn't do this. Nobody discussed doing this. It simply happened, the way most things in this house simply happen, as if the mansion itself is a machine built entirely out of other people's labor and your own blissful ignorance. Constance draws back the curtains, and the full weight of the morning hits you, carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones, a newsboy hollering something about a scandal on Wall Street, and faintly, the smell of coal smoke mixed with somebody's aggressively expensive perfume drifting up from the street below. You are, by any measure, one of the luckiest people alive in 1887 New York. You just haven't figured out yet whether that's a blessing or a very elaborate trap. Your bed itself deserves a mention. It's a 4-poster monstrosity carved from mahogany, topped with a canopy embroidered by nuns in Belgium who, according to the salesman, specialize in bedding for people of consequence. You're buried under 3 separate blankets of increasing softness, the outermost one supposedly spun from cashmere, goats raised specifically for people who find regular wool a bit much. Whether that's true or just something your decorator invented on the spot, you'll never know, and frankly, you've stopped asking questions like that. Ignorance in this house is not just bliss, it's practically a hobby. You finally sit fully upright, and the day's first real decision presents itself. Get up now and risk being early to breakfast, thereby appearing eager, or linger a while longer and claim you were resting your eyes. a phrase that in this household covers everything from genuine fatigue to mild hangovers to simply not wanting to deal with your mother-in-law yet. As you swing your legs over the side of the bed, you catch your reflection in one of the room's absurdly numerous mirrors, 4, at last count, though you suspect there's a fifth hidden behind a tapestry somewhere, just in case you need to check your posture from an angle you hadn't previously considered. You look, if you're honest, like someone who has never once in their life carried their own luggage. You'd be offended by that thought if it weren't so completely, comfortably true. Constance hands you the morning paper, folded so the most alarming headlines are tucked underneath, and the safer ones, society announcements. A review of last night's opera, sit right on top. It's less a newspaper and more a carefully curated suggestion of what your day should feel like before you've even had breakfast. Did the Whitmores really cancel their annual ball? Is it true the Delacroix twins are no longer speaking? And is there any truth to the rumor that someone's prize mastiff got loose during a dinner party and ate an entire tray of lobster patties? You'll find out. You always do. Welcome to morning number 1 of many identical, gloriously ridiculous mornings ahead. The business of getting dressed. Nobody in the Gilded Age just puts on clothes. Clothes in this house are assembled piece by piece, layer by layer, with the seriousness of a general preparing troops for battle, except the battle is against the very concept of comfort, and comfort loses every single time. For a gentleman, the process begins with your valet, a solemn man named Aldous who has strong, unshakable opinions about starch. Your shirt arrives so rigid it could technically stand up on its own, and the collar, the collar is a separate piece entirely, snapped into place with enough force to make your neck genuinely reconsider its life choices. Aldous ties your cravat with the concentration of a man diffusing something explosive, because in his mind, he essentially is. One crooked knot, he's told you more than once, and society will assume you've either had a stroke or simply given up on life. For a lady, the ordeal multiplies. First comes the chemise. A simple linen layer that represents the last few minutes of actual physical comfort you'll experience until you're back in bed tonight. Then the corset, laced by your maid with a firm tug that makes you gasp, not from pain exactly, but from the sudden and total realization that deep breathing is now a luxury reserved for people with fewer social obligations. Over that, petticoats stacked like geological layers, a bustle that gives you the silhouette of a very fashionable teapot, and finally the dress itself, silk or velvet, hand-embroidered and expensive enough that you're instructed not to sit down in it unless absolutely necessary. Accessories require their own committee meeting. Gloves that must reach precisely to the elbow, no higher, no lower. A brooch selected specifically to suggest wealth without appearing to be trying too hard, which is its own strange skill nobody explicitly teaches you, but that you're expected to have mastered by adulthood. Your husband, meanwhile, is wrestling with cufflinks shaped like tiny anchors, a pocket watch on a chain heavy enough to anchor an actual ship, and a top hat so tall that Aldous has already warned him twice about the chandelier in the front hall. By the time you're both fully assembled, you've burned more calories getting dressed than you likely will for the rest of the day combined. You stand in front of the mirror, corseted, buttoned, pinned, and polished, and you privately wonder how anyone in this century ever managed to get anything done, given that simply preparing to leave the bedroom apparently requires the coordinated effort of 4 separate staff members and roughly 45 minutes. But you look undeniably magnificent, slightly breathless, slightly numb in places you didn't know could go numb, but magnificent all the same. And really, isn't that the whole point? Breakfast as theater. Downstairs, the dining room table is already dressed more elaborately than most people get dressed for their own weddings. There are 11 pieces of silverware at your place setting, 3 kinds of eggs prepared in ways that seem specifically engineered to make you forget eggs are, at their core, a fairly humble food, and a floral centerpiece so tall it partially obscures your view of your own husband across the table. You are not, under any circumstances, allowed to look hungry. That would suggest need, and need is deeply unfashionable. Instead, you're meant to approach the meal as though you simply happened upon this feast by accident and might, on a whim, decide not to touch it at all, even as your stomach quietly composes odes to the ham. The first course is fruit, sliced with a geometric precision that makes you wonder if the kitchen employs a part-time mathematician. Then the eggs arrive, poached, scrambled, and one variation drenched in a sauce so labor-intensive that someone clearly spent the better part of an hour on it, only for it to be gone in 4 bites and never mentioned again. Meats follow: glazed ham, bacon cut so precisely it looks machine-made, sausages that dare you to find a single imperfection. Toast, when it finally arrives, isn't simply toast. It's sliced to an exact and specific thickness, and someone, you're honestly not sure who, has arranged for your family's initials to be subtly stamped into the crust, because apparently even your carbohydrates need to know who they belong to. There's coffee, brewed in a silver pot by a member of staff who trained, according to family legend, under an actual French chef, though nobody's ever confirmed this and everyone's too polite to ask. There's fresh orange juice, treated with the reverence of a religious relic, since fresh citrus in New York in autumn is roughly as difficult to procure as peace between 2 feuding society matrons. Conversation stays deliberately light. The opera, the weather in Newport, a rumor about someone's cousin's questionable new business venture involving Western land. Nothing too specific, nothing too real. Breakfast conversation in this house operates a bit like a minefield where the mines are simply anything interesting. By the time the plates are cleared, you're stuffed, slightly dazed, and only vaguely aware that you've just spent the better part of an hour eating a meal that most working families in this same city could stretch across an entire week. You rise from the table, corset creaking in protest, and privately consider that breakfast in this life isn't nourishment. It's an endurance event with better linens. Running the machine. You don't lift a finger in this house unless it's to ring a bell, and even that feels like an exaggeration, because half the time the staff seems to anticipate your needs before you fully form them yourself. Your household isn't so much a home as it is a small, extremely well-dressed corporation, with departments, hierarchies, and its own quiet internal politics that you're only ever half aware of. At the top sits your butler, a man named Whitfield who moves through the house with the gravity of someone who has personally seen every family secret and chosen, out of professional discretion, to file it away rather than gossip about it. Whitfield knows when the coal delivery is running late, which guest is secretly a fortune hunter, and precisely how many minutes before dinner the soup should be plated for optimal temperature. He is, without question, the single most competent person under your roof, and you both know it. Beneath him, the housekeeper runs the maids with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has never once in her life left a task half finished. She knows the household's every secret, which vase gets dusted twice a week, and which one is quietly, deliberately neglected because nobody actually likes it. Housemaids drift through the rooms like quiet ghosts, plumping pillows the moment your back is turned, buffing floors so relentlessly that you occasionally worry about slipping on your own reflection. Footmen stand at attention near doorways, their primary skill apparently being the ability to remain motionless for extraordinarily long stretches while looking vaguely dignified. Their actual duties remain something of a mystery to you, lighting lamps, occasionally walking the dog, and appearing out of nowhere the instant a door needs opening. In the kitchen, your cook reigns as an undisputed monarch, wielding a wooden spoon like a scepter and issuing threats about soufflés collapsing that somehow always seem to carry the weight of genuine tragedy. Beneath her, an army of kitchen maids peel, chop, and stir in a kind of controlled chaos that somehow, every single evening, resolves itself into a flawless 7-course meal. Beyond the core staff, specialists drift in and out. A florist who has opinions about your taste in chrysanthemums, a laundress who could probably blackmail half of Manhattan with what she knows from stained cuffs alone, and a coachman who has developed a permanent expression of weary patience from years of last-minute trips to the opera. All of this operates on your behalf, mostly invisible, entirely essential, and completely taken for granted. You ring a bell, and somewhere in the house, a small chain reaction begins. You've never once had to think about how the machine works. You've only ever had to enjoy its results. The ritual of the bath. Bathing in this era isn't a quick rinse. It's an occasion, complete with staging, supporting cast, and if you're being honest, a fairly bewildering amount of standing around while other people do the actual work. The process begins long before you've even decided to bathe, with footmen hauling can of hot water up from the kitchen boiler, each one checked for temperature by someone whose entire job, it seems, is water temperature diplomacy. Your enormous porcelain tub, imported at what you assume was tremendous expense, is finally filled, scattered with rose petals for reasons nobody has ever fully explained to you, though you suspect it has more to do with appearances than hygiene. Your maid undresses you with the careful reverence of someone handling museum artifacts, folding each layer of silk and linen as though it might otherwise disintegrate. A folding screen is positioned nearby, technically for privacy, though given that at least 2 staff members remain in the room throughout, its actual function seems more decorative than practical. Once submerged, you're offered a rotation of soaps, one for your hands, one for your face, one for your feet, and one mysterious bar made of goat's milk that your maid insists is very Parisian, a phrase that in this house apparently justifies almost anything. Someone opens a window to release the steam, which mostly succeeds in letting in a draft, and on one memorable occasion, an extremely judgmental pigeon. You're offered a facial treatment of honey and crushed almonds, which inevitably slides partway into the bathwater, prompting a brief, silent moment where you consider the structural integrity of your own dignity. Eventually, satisfied that you've been sufficiently soaked, scrubbed, and pampered, you're extracted from the tub and wrapped in towels plush enough to double as blankets, then bundled into a warmed robe while your slippers wait, positioned with uncanny precision exactly where your feet will land. By the time the whole ordeal concludes, you're cleaner than any human being strictly needs to be, faintly dizzy from the sheer ceremony of it all, and quietly grateful that at least this particular ritual, unlike breakfast, doesn't require conversation. A day of purposeful idleness. With the household running itself and your fortune presumably being managed by men in offices you've never visited, your afternoon stretches out ahead of you, entirely, almost oppressively free. In the Gilded Age, leisure isn't relaxation, it's a full-time occupation, complete with its own equipment, its own uniforms, and its own unspoken competitive edge. Croquet is the reigning favorite, played on a lawn so meticulously maintained it practically apologizes for existing. You grip your mallet, adjust a hat wide enough to shade a small carriage, and proceed through a match that's less about winning and more about outlasting your rivals with an expression of serene indifference. Cheating would be unthinkable, mostly because there's always a footman nearby to settle disputes, but also because the actual goal has very little to do with the ball ever reaching the final wicket. If croquet feels too strenuous, there's always the option of a gentle carriage tour, a stroll through a private garden, or, for the truly ambitious, a spot of amateur ornithology, which mostly involves standing very still and hopping a bird does something interesting nearby. Some families take up collecting, butterflies, porcelain, ancient coins, or, in a few well-documented cases, enough European art to eventually justify opening a small private museum, less out of genuine passion and more as a very expensive form of one-upmanship. The real sport, of course, is the quiet rivalry simmering beneath every polite interaction. Your neighbor installs a new marble fountain, so you commission a slightly larger one. Someone hosts a garden party with an imported string quartet, so you book one with 2 additional cellists. None of it is ever said aloud. All of it is understood perfectly by everyone involved. By late afternoon, you've accomplished by any objective measure absolutely nothing, and yet you feel strangely exhausted, the particular fatigue that comes from performing leisure rather than actually experiencing it. You settle into a shaded chair, request a cool drink, and reflect with only mild irony on another full day of extremely elegant nothing. Exercise performed carefully. Physical activity is fashionable in this era, provided it never actually resembles physical exertion. You could simply be carried everywhere, and on lazier days you're tempted to, but appearing athletic, or at least appearing to attempt athleticism, has become something of a status symbol among your circle. Tennis is the preferred display. You arrive at the private court in an outfit so layered and starched it seems specifically engineered to prevent movement, then proceed through a match best described as spirited standing, punctuated by gentle taps of the ball and the occasional polite laugh when your opponent misses entirely. Should your pulse actually rise, the appropriate response is to call immediately for lemonade and retreat to the shade, declaring the exercise wonderfully invigorating between gasps. For those seeking something with a touch more drama, fencing offers the appearance of danger without any of the actual risk. A hired instructor, ideally with an accent from somewhere vaguely European, guides you through 30 minutes of careful parrying, ensuring nobody actually gets hit and everybody leaves with a satisfying sense of having done something daring. Horseback riding rounds out the routine, a slow, dignified circuit around the estate grounds, side saddle for the ladies, because nothing communicates robust health quite like balancing atop an enormous animal while wearing a corset laced tight enough to make deep breathing a distant memory. Actual galloping is strongly discouraged. It's loud, it's undignified, and worst of all, it risks an unseemly flush to the cheeks. By the time you return indoors, you feel accomplished, refreshed, and crucially, not remotely disheveled. Exercise in this world was never really about the body. It was about being witnessed appearing healthy, which, you're slowly realizing, describes an enormous portion of your entire existence. The department store as battlefield. By mid-afternoon, the carriage is called, and you set off toward one of the great new department stores, those glittering cathedrals of consumption that have sprung up along the avenue like they were always meant to be there. A uniformed doorman sweeps the entrance open for you as if announcing royalty, which, in this neighborhood, isn't entirely inaccurate. Inside, the air smells of new silk and old money. A personal shopping clerk appears within moments, radiating the particular enthusiasm of someone who works on commission, and guides you through department after department of things you didn't know you needed until roughly 4 seconds ago. You start with hats, though your closet already resembles a small millinery warehouse, because apparently new season means new hats regardless of how many perfectly good ones you already own. The shoe department presents its own philosophical puzzle. You try on a pair of delicate imported slippers, marveling at their beauty while privately acknowledging you won't be able to stand in them for more than a few minutes without genuine discomfort. Your clerk assures you that comfort is a concept best left to people who actually have to walk places, which, when you think about it, describes almost nobody in your immediate circle. Gloves, scarves, and a truly staggering array of parasols round out the excursion. You select 2 of each, because who's to say what the weather might do, and besides, matching accessories to 3 separate outfits seems only reasonable. Trinkets scattered throughout the store call to you as well: a small gold-plated opera glass, an ivory fan, a porcelain figurine whose only apparent purpose is to sit on a shelf and be admired by dinner guests. Payment, when it happens at all, is handled with a practiced wave toward your account ledger. You never actually touch money in these transactions. Money exists somewhere in the abstract, managed by people you've never met, in an office you've never visited, for reasons you've never fully questioned. Your only task is to sign your name with an appropriately elegant flourish and accept the clerk's genuine or manufactured. You can never quite tell compliments on your exceptional taste. By the time you climb back into the carriage, you're weighed down with packages and burdened with the vague, comfortable knowledge that you've contributed once again to the ongoing expansion of your own wardrobe, at the expense of a closet that was already, by any reasonable standard, entirely full. New marvels for an old house. Why bother lifting a finger when a machine could do it for you, badly, loudly, and at enormous expense? The Gilded Age household is a testing ground for invention, and no gadget is too impractical to install, provided it announces to visitors that you are, without question, keeping pace with progress. Speaking tubes connect your study to the kitchen, in theory allowing you to relay instructions with perfect clarity. In practice, you find yourself shouting into a brass mouthpiece, hoping your words survive the journey intact, and more than once your simple request for tea has arrived downstairs as something entirely different, resulting in a confused delivery of biscuits and a mildly offended cook. Electric lighting has recently been installed throughout the house, replacing gas in most of the main rooms, though the wiring remains new enough that every switch carries a small thrill of uncertainty. Will the room illuminate gracefully, or will the whole floor plunge briefly into darkness while your butler scrambles for candles? Either outcome, you've noticed, makes for excellent dinner conversation. In the parlor sits your player piano, the pride of every fashionable household, capable of performing waltzes and the occasional ragtime number without requiring anyone present to actually know how to play. You crank the lever, settle back, and allow the machine to take full credit for a performance you had absolutely nothing to do with. The kitchen boasts its newest and most impressive resident, an enormous icebox, imported specifically for the purpose of keeping perishables cold without daily deliveries of ice, blocks the size of footstools. Though, of course, ice blocks the size of footstools still arrive regularly anyway, carried in by men whose forearms suggest a level of physical labor entirely absent from your own daily routine. And then there's the telephone, mounted proudly in the front hall, connecting you to perhaps 4 other households in the entire city who also own one. Calls require routing through an operator who seems to know more about your family's social calendar than you do yourself. Still, you answer every ring with theatrical gravity, as though speaking into the very future itself, static and all. A household full of pampered creatures. No respectable Gilded Age home is complete without an assortment of animals living considerably better than most working families 3 blocks over. Your household is no exception, and frankly, you wouldn't have it any other way. The family dog, a groomed and perfumed spaniel named Fitzgerald, breakfasts on a small portion of beef broth prepared personally by the cook, who occasionally mutters about when she'll be permitted to cook for actual humans again. Fitzgerald sleeps on an embroidered cushion, positioned in a sunbeam scheduled specifically for his comfort, because apparently even sunlight in this house operates on a strict itinerary. Your cat, a haughty Persian named Duchess, wears a collar set with small gemstones that likely cost more than your coachman's annual salary, though nobody's ever actually done that math out loud. She spends her days surveying the household from various elevated positions, occasionally deigning to grace someone's lap, an event treated with the reverence typically reserved for minor religious visitations. In the morning room, an aviary of imported parrots provides a constant, occasionally embarrassing soundtrack, having picked up phrases from staff members that were never intended for polite company. One bird has, somewhat alarmingly, mastered a perfect imitation of your mother-in-law's laugh, a party trick you find equal parts delightful and deeply unsettling. Should a neighbor acquire something exotic, a pair of Angora rabbits, say, or a small monkey, you find yourself under quiet pressure to match or exceed the gesture, less out of genuine interest in exotic pet ownership, and more out of the same competitive instinct that governs literally everything else in this social circle. Pet birthdays, when they occur, are celebrated with a seriousness bordering on the absurd small cakes, engraved invitations, and on one particularly memorable occasion, an actual ribbon ceremony for best behaved among the assembled animal guests. You attend these events with a straight face, mostly because everyone else does. And questioning the tradition seems somehow more socially risky than simply going along with it. Tea time and the art of elegant gossip. By 3 o'clock, the drawing room transforms into something resembling a very well-dressed intelligence operation. Tea is served, but tea is merely the excuse. The real business of the afternoon is information: who was seen where, with whom, wearing what, and under exactly what circumstances that might later prove useful. The guest list has been curated with the precision of a diplomatic summit. To be excluded is a quiet but unmistakable social signal, and everyone at the table knows it, which lends even the simplest exchange of pleasantries an undercurrent of calculated tension. Conversation opens safely enough: the weather, a recent charity event, the relative merits of one tea blend over another. But it doesn't stay safe for long. Someone mentions, with studied casualness, that a certain young lady was seen leaving a restaurant rather later than propriety generally allows. Eyebrows rise. A scone is set down mid-bite. The real performance has begun. You've learned, over many such afternoons, exactly how to react to each level of scandal. A slightly raised eyebrow for the mild stuff. A soft, delicate gasp for something juicier. And for the truly shocking revelations, a well-timed sip of tea, deployed specifically to buy yourself a moment to compose an appropriately scandalized expression. The servants circulating with fresh pots and refilled plates absorb every word, and you've long suspected they could write their own scandal sheet with more accuracy than the actual newspapers, if they were ever so inclined, which, mercifully for the household's reputation, they never quite are. By the time the last cup is drained, alliances have shifted, at least one reputation has been quietly, politely dismantled, and everyone departs with just enough new information to make the next gathering worth attending. Tea, you've come to understand, was never really about tea at all. The business of marrying well. Somewhere in the middle of all this glittering excess sits the season's true sporting event: finding your children or yourself an appropriately advantageous match. Romance, in theory, remains a lovely idea. In practice, everyone at the ball is doing quiet arithmetic behind their smiles. The debutante season kicks off with a flurry of balls, luncheons, and carefully engineered introductions. Young women in white gloves and rehearsed expressions are presented to society like fine goods at auction, evaluated on posture, conversation, and most importantly, family name. Mothers hover at the edges of every ballroom, eyes narrowed, silently ranking the competition with the focus of seasoned strategists. Eligible young men circulate with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some genuinely enjoy the game. Others seem to have been raised specifically for this moment and possess roughly the personality of a well-dressed statue. Either way, if a man carries a substantial fortune, he can expect to be trailed by a rotating cast of hopeful debutantes and their extremely attentive mothers. Behind closed doors, the real negotiations unfold, not over love, but over dowries, property, and the kind of arrangements typically reserved for business mergers. One family offers a generous sum, contingent on the inclusion of a summer property. Another bargains over railroad shares. If talks stall, there's always a well-placed aunt willing to threaten a scandal loud enough to speed things along. Reputation is everything in these negotiations. A single ill-advised flirtation, a whisper of financial trouble, or an unfortunate family rumor can unravel months of careful positioning in a single evening. And so families monitor each other's behavior with the vigilance of accountants auditing a suspicious ledger. When love and financial sense do align, it's treated as something of a minor miracle, celebrated with genuine relief by everyone involved. More often, couples proceed with practical affection and a prenuptial agreement thick enough to double as a doorstop. The wedding itself becomes its own spectacle: towering cakes, cartloads of flowers, and a guest list balanced with the delicacy of a peace treaty, designed carefully to avoid reigniting any dormant family feuds. Life below stairs. While you glide through your gilded routines largely unaware, an entire second household hums along beneath your feet, governed by its own rules, hierarchies, and quietly fierce rivalries. You only ever glimpse this world when something goes wrong, a dropped tray, a scorched roast, at which point it briefly, alarmingly, becomes your problem too. Your butler sits at the top of this hierarchy, his word carrying more weight below stairs than most royal decrees. He's the only staff member permitted to move freely between your world and theirs, trusted with the household's genuine secrets, and universally regarded, both above and below, as the true center of gravity in the house. The housekeeper governs the female staff with equal authority, tracking every stain, every misplaced item, and every budding romance between a footman and a scullery made with the thoroughness of a woman who has genuinely seen it all. Her approval is hard-won and once earned, fiercely protective. In the kitchen, your cook rules over her domain like a small, irritable monarch, and the entire household's mood seems to rise and fall with the success of her soufflés. A burnt roast isn't just a culinary failure down there. It's a full-blown crisis capable of rippling through every level of staff by dinner time. Housemaids rise before dawn, footmen stand at attention for hours, and laundry maids, working in perpetual steam, seem to know everything happening in the house before anyone upstairs has even noticed it's happening. Promotions are fiercely contested, alliances form and dissolve, and through it all, there's a genuine camaraderie forged in shared exhaustion. Staff dinners full of laughter, quiet celebrations of birthdays, and the occasional forbidden romance blooming near the kitchen fire. To them, your family's dramas are endlessly entertaining, analyzed and retold below stairs with considerably more accuracy and considerably more amusement than you'd probably like to imagine. The ball. Nightfall changes everything. Dinner was only the overture. The ball is the main performance, and by the time the gaslights flicker on along the avenue, your household has been preparing for hours. Invitations went out weeks ago, engraved and scented, and at least one family remains locked in a quiet feud over who did or didn't make the final list. Your evening wardrobe alone takes the better part of 2 hours to assemble. A gown stitched with imported lace, a necklace heavy enough to leave a faint impression on your collarbone by the end of the night, and gloves so precisely fitted that removing them later becomes its own small ordeal. Your carriage joins a slow, glittering procession toward the host's front steps, wheels crunching over gravel while you make final adjustments and silently rehearse the correct order of greetings. Inside, the entrance hall glows with more candles than seems entirely safe, and your name is announced at the top of the staircase before you descend into a room already swirling with music and quietly ferocious social calculation. The waltz isn't simply a dance here, it's a small negotiation. Dance cards are guarded like winning lottery tickets, traded and bartered with the seriousness of stock certificates. Choose a poor partner, and you're locked into several minutes of stilted conversation and bruised toes. Choose well, and you may walk away with enough gossip to last a fortnight. If the evening happens to be a masquerade, an entirely different energy takes over. Masks grant a strange, temporary freedom, the chance to flirt, gossip, or dance with far less caution than usual, right up until someone's disguise inevitably slips and the room dissolves into laughter and mock outrage. You spend half the night wondering who's really behind each mask, and the other half hopping your own holds up until the traditional midnight unmasking. Supper appears around midnight: oysters, champagne, cold chicken, accompanied by murmured debates over dessert, and occasionally a genuinely unplanned proposal, hastily walked back the following morning after cooler heads prevail. By 2 a.m, only the truly committed remain, gentlemen leaning on canes, ladies fanning themselves with visible exhaustion, and an orchestra playing its 6th encore with what can only be described as professional desperation. You finally climb back into your carriage as the sky turns pale, slippers dangling from your fingers, perfume mixed with fatigue, already unsure whether you made a new ally, started a fresh feud, or possibly did both without fully realizing it. Either way, you've survived another night of the season's endless, glittering circuit. Summer at Newport. When the city grows too hot and too crowded even for your considerable tolerance, it's time to relocate the entire household to the coast. Your cottage in Newport is, in reality, a 40-room stone palace overlooking the ocean, staffed nearly as heavily as your Manhattan residence, and every bit as extravagant, if slightly more relaxed in tone. Arrival is its own small production. Trunks, hat boxes, and staff arriving in a coordinated convoy, while the local florist scrambles to fulfill your standing order for fresh arrangements delivered 3 times a week. Guests are shown to suites named for European monarchs, and if you're unlucky, you're assigned the room modeled after a particularly ornate French king, complete with a bed so elaborately carved it looks better suited to a museum than an actual night's sleep. Days settle into a rhythm of leisurely competition. Morning tennis matches unfold in crisp linen, the real contest often being who can appear least affected by the exertion. Afternoons bring croquet on the lawn, painting lessons where every subject somehow resembles someone's prize-winning poodle, and long promenades along the cliffs, where the goal is to be seen, admired, and never, under any circumstances, caught looking tired. Porch conversations in the late afternoon carry a particular edge, light on the surface, sharp underneath. Whose ballroom addition is nearing completion, whose imported marble arrived a shade darker than promised, whose cousin was spotted somewhere distinctly unfashionable. Nothing is said outright, but everything is understood. Evenings bring 10-course dinners seated according to careful social calculus, rival relatives separated by at least one buffer guest, followed by dancing, and more often than not, fireworks over the lawn timed precisely to catch the neighbor's attention. Old grudges simmer quietly in the background, a swapped sugar bowl here, a pointed remark there. But by August, everyone agrees almost sincerely that nothing brings a family together quite like several weeks of shared proximity, forced elegance, and mutual, gently competitive exhaustion. Scandal and its consequences. Reputation in this world is the only currency that truly matters, and it's remarkably fragile. A single whispered rumor, timed correctly, can undo months, even years of careful social positioning. Everyone knows this. Everyone fears it. And everyone quietly plays the game anyway. It usually starts small. A note passed discreetly at a dinner party. A servant overhearing something they shouldn't have. Perhaps a debutante vanishes just days before her wedding, leaving only a hastily written letter and a household in quiet uproar. Or a distant cousin surfaces unexpectedly with a legitimate claim to a portion of the family fortune, sending your normally unshakable family lawyer into a visible sweat. When scandal does go public, the newspapers move with startling speed. The very papers your family quietly funds through generous subscriptions, somehow always seeming to know exactly when to strike hardest. Headlines exaggerate, insinuate, and occasionally outright fabricate, and there's rarely much you can do except manage the fallout as gracefully as possible. Strategies for damage control are well established. Some scandals are smoothed over with a timely charitable donation. Others are managed by quietly sending the offending party abroad for an extended tour until the gossip cools. And some, unfortunately, simply have to be endured, weathered with denial, dignity, and the strategic deployment of an extra glass of champagne at every subsequent public appearance. The families who survive scandal best are rarely the ones with nothing to hide. There's no such family in this circle, but the ones who understand the unwritten rules well enough to manage the story before the story manages them. Everyone, it turns out, has something buried. The truly skilled simply know exactly when to dust it off and when to bury it a little deeper. When the money disappears. For all its glitter, the Gilded Age fortune is a remarkably unstable thing, and nothing illustrates that quite like an afternoon on Wall Street gone wrong. One bad rumor about a railroad, one overextended investment, and suddenly, the family that hosted last month's most talked about ball is quietly calculating how many silver hairbrushes might fetch a decent price at auction. It rarely announces itself all at once. First, there are whispers, a company overextended, a market suddenly nervous. Then your banker appears at the door looking considerably less composed than usual, mumbling about liquidity while clutching a ledger like it might explode. The household, naturally, is instructed to carry on exactly as before, a performance of normalcy that grows increasingly strained with each passing day. Small economies begin quietly, perhaps switching to a slightly less expensive champagne, or trimming the weekly flour order, changes so minor to an outside observer that they'd never notice, but that feel, internally, like the beginning of the end. Letters from the bank are opened slowly, read with practiced calm, and then tucked away to be dealt with later, which is to say, avoided for as long as humanly possible. If ruin does arrive in full, the response follows a familiar script. Family heirlooms quietly inventoried, difficult conversations had behind closed doors, and through it all, a stiff upper lip maintained at almost any cost. A final, lavish party is sometimes thrown on the last of the remaining funds, one last grand gesture before the retreat begins, ideally loud enough that nobody quite notices it doubles as a farewell. Recovery, when it happens, tends to arrive through some combination of luck, stubbornness, and a well-timed inheritance. Failing that, families simply reinvent themselves elsewhere. Europe, typically, where postcards home describe sun-drenched adventures that conveniently omit any mention of the word bankruptcy. Either way, the lesson is always the same. In this world, fortunes can vanish nearly as fast as they were made, and the only real skill is knowing how to fall with your dignity, and at least one good story intact. Growing old gilded. Eventually, and by the standards of this era, that might mean barely past 50, you begin thinking seriously about legacy. Retirement in any quiet, restful sense is unthinkable. Instead, your energy shifts from balls and business towards something considerably more permanent, making absolutely certain your name outlives you. The competition for legacy is every bit as fierce as the competition for status ever was. A rival funds a new hospital wing. Another endows a university library. You find yourself, almost without meaning to, drawn into an entirely new arms race. This one measured not in gowns or carriages, but in plaques, portraits, and buildings bearing your family name. Even your final resting place becomes a project. You consult sculptors, debate the relative merits of Greek columns versus something more restrained, and ultimately settle on a mausoleum substantial enough to be genuinely impressive without tipping into outright ostentation. A distinction that, at this stage of life, feels surprisingly important to you. There are quieter rituals too. Memoirs, carefully edited to omit the more embarrassing chapters. Long conversations with the family lawyer about trusts and inheritances, and quiet decisions about which relatives deserve generosity and which deserve, at most, a polite mention. Grandchildren gather at your feet occasionally, half fascinated and half bewildered by stories of a world with stricter manners, and somehow, even more elaborate hats. Beneath the accumulated wealth and careful planning, there's a genuine, quieter reflection too on friendships kept and lost, feuds never quite resolved, and the strange, gilded life you somehow found yourself living. You hope in the end to be remembered kindly. Failing that, you'll settle for being remembered impressively, preferably in marble. Behind closed club doors. For the men of this world, there exists an entirely separate sanctuary, the private club, where admission depends on considerably more than money. The right name matters. The right sponsor matters more. And a portrait of some distinguished ancestor hanging somewhere on the premises certainly doesn't hurt. Inside, the air is thick with cigar smoke and quiet self-importance. Leather armchairs, worn soft by decades of the same handful of members, are reserved unofficially but absolutely for the oldest and most established among them. Newcomers perch carefully at the edges, aware that a single wrong word could set their reputation back months. Conversation here ranges from politics to business to gentle, practiced mockery of absent friends, always delivered with enough charm to avoid outright offense. Lunch is heavy and traditional: roast beef, thick sauces, puddings requiring genuine architectural planning to slice properly, and the real business of the afternoon happens quietly afterward, over brandy, in the low murmur of favors exchanged and alliances tested. Membership itself is a slow, deliberate process, involving sponsors, references, and occasionally a mysterious blackball that ends someone's chances before they've even properly begun. Once inside, though, you're granted access to a strange, timeless world where railroads, telegraphs, and the changing city outside seem to matter considerably less than the next round of drinks, and the comfortable, familiar company of men who have known each other, in some cases, since childhood. Secret rooms and hidden doors. A house this large practically demands its own secrets, and no self-respecting architect designs a Gilded Age mansion without at least one concealed passage, disguised door, or hidden room tucked behind something unassuming. A bookshelf, a mirror, a section of wall paneling that swings open with a barely audible click. What begins as practical, a discreet service corridor, a hidden linen closet, tends to spiral into something considerably more elaborate. A study concealed behind the library shelves, accessible only by pulling the correct volume from an otherwise ordinary row of books. A soundproofed music room where, rumor has it, more than one difficult family conversation has taken place entirely undetected by the rest of the household. These spaces serve real purposes too. An unwelcome visitor, an overly persistent reporter, or simply an evening you'd rather not explain can all be avoided via a well-placed hidden exit, leaving you to reappear elsewhere in the house minutes later, humming pleasantly and claiming to have simply been checking on the greenhouse. For guests, discovering these passages becomes something of an unofficial party game. Usually after a glass or two of champagne loosens both curiosity and caution. More than once, a wandering guest has been genuinely misplaced for the better part of an evening, only to be discovered contentedly exploring the wine cellar. The staff, naturally, know every shortcut in the house and take quiet, private delight in never quite explaining them. The holidays gilded. Christmas in this house begins its preparations weeks in advance. Somewhere around the point your last summer guest has finally, politely, been sent home. Your butler produces a checklist long enough to intimidate a small army, and the household mobilizes into a flurry of decoration, baking, and quietly competitive festivity. The tree, sourced from somewhere impressively far north, requires a small team simply to maneuver through the front door. Decorating becomes a genuine family event, with each relative contributing something increasingly elaborate: strings of pearls, hand-blown glass ornaments, and on one particularly memorable year, a live peacock perched somewhat precariously near the top, an addition nobody fully remembers agreeing to. In the kitchen, your cook oversees the construction of gingerbread structures large enough to nearly qualify as guest housing, alongside roasted geese, glazed hams, and a traditional steamed pudding regarded by the household with equal parts affection and mild safety concern. Gifts are distributed with genuine ceremony, staff included, and the nursery briefly transforms into what can only be described as a supervised toy disaster area. Entertainment is, naturally, mandatory. There are recitations, impromptu concerts, and a family tradition of amateur theatrical charades that inevitably descends into good-natured chaos. The year your uncle became genuinely stuck inside a homemade turkey costume has, by now, achieved the status of permanent family legend. The evening typically closes with a candlelit walk through the garden, toasts to the year behind and the one ahead, and a general, cheerful acknowledgement that the holidays in this household were never really about restraint. Excess, it turns out, is simply the family's love language, expressed annually in tinsel, sugar, and mild structural risk to the household chandelier. Doctors, tonics, and questionable advice. Should you feel even slightly unwell, your family physician arrives promptly, medical bag in hand, ready to diagnose you with something suitably dramatic, whether or not the symptoms particularly warrant it. Medicine in this era operates somewhere between genuine science and confident guesswork, with treatments ranging from the mildly eccentric to the frankly alarming. A simple headache might be treated with a tonic containing generous amounts of opium, guaranteed to dull the pain while inspiring an unusual enthusiasm for reorganizing the furniture. Persistent nerves, a diagnosis applied fairly liberally to anything not otherwise explained, are commonly treated with a recommended trip to the seaside, fresh air apparently being considered a cure for nearly everything short of an actual broken bone. Leeches remain a surprisingly popular treatment, applied with total confidence despite results that, to the untrained eye, look considerably less scientific than promised. Bleeding, similarly, persists as a favored remedy for ailments ranging from fever to simple exhaustion, administered by physicians who speak about the process with a conviction that rarely seems to be backed by improved outcomes. Newer treatments occasionally make an appearance too: mild electric shock devices, vibrating chairs, and various tonics promising miraculous results for everything from asthma to heartbreak. The truly practical response, passed down quietly through generations of Gilded Age patients, tends to involve nodding politely at whatever the doctor prescribes, and then discreetly disposing of the more questionable remedies before anyone notices. Survival, in the end, seems to owe rather more to good genetics and reasonable luck than to any particular medical wisdom of the era. But you endure it all with good humor, mostly because complaining too loudly about your physician's methods would be, in this social circle, considerably more scandalous than the illness itself. Settling in for the night. And so, you've made it through another full day in the Gilded Age, barely. Breakfast fit for royalty, an afternoon of performed leisure, an evening of dancing until your feet gave out, and through it all, the constant, quiet hum of a household working tirelessly just out of sight to keep the whole gleaming machine running smoothly. It's easy, looking back on it, to laugh at the sheer excess, the jeweled pets, the marble mausoleums, the corsets engineered to make breathing an act of will. But underneath all that glitter was a surprisingly familiar kind of exhaustion, the quiet pressure of keeping up appearances, the constant low hum of worry about reputation, fortune, and whether tomorrow might bring some new, unexpected disaster dressed up as an ordinary Tuesday. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, maybe without a canopy, maybe without 6 attendants standing by, let yourself feel a small, genuine gratitude for quiet rooms, for simple comforts, for the fact that nobody needs to lace you into anything before you're allowed to fall asleep. History, even at its most gilded, was always just people muddling through as best they could, anxious, hopeful, a little ridiculous, and occasionally very funny in hindsight. If they could find their way to laughter even in the middle of all that gold leaf and quiet dread, there's a good chance we can too. Good night. May your dreams be lighter than a Fifth Avenue guest list, and your tomorrow just a touch more comfortable than the one you just left behind. The calling card ritual. Somewhere between breakfast and lunch, a silver tray arrives stacked with small, stiff rectangles of paper calling cards, left by visitors who came and went while you were otherwise occupied. You study the pile the way a general studies a battle map, because in this world, a calling card is never just a calling card. It's a message, coded, weighted, and occasionally quietly devastating. Your own card is a small masterpiece in itself, thick, engraved, bearing your name in a typeface so ornate it's barely legible without good light. Every detail matters, whether you deliver it yourself or send it via footman, whether a corner is folded, and if so, which corner and why, and how promptly you return the visit once it's been made. Wait too long and you risk being quietly, permanently dropped from someone's guest list. The rules governing these visits rival any legal code in their complexity. Certain days are designated for morning calls, others for afternoon ones. A card left without a personal visit signals something entirely different than a card accompanied by an actual conversation. A card bearing only a surname, with no accompanying note, is its own small act of social theater, implying that either you already know precisely who sent it, or you're simply not important enough to warrant an introduction. Once admitted for an actual visit, you're seated with careful precision, roughly 3 feet from your hostess, and conversation proceeds along strictly appropriate lines. The weather, recent charitable efforts, perhaps a very gentle mention of last week's opera. Business, politics, and anything resembling genuine emotion are entirely off the table. Visits are timed almost instinctively. 15 minutes reads as appropriately attentive, anything shorter suggests indifference, and anything longer suggests you have nowhere better to be, which is, in this circle, its own quiet insult. Fail to navigate this ritual correctly even once, and the consequences can follow you for an entire season. Reputation here is exactly as fragile as the porcelain it's served alongside, and rebuilding it takes considerably longer than the 15 minutes it took to damage. The promenade down 5th Avenue. By late morning, it's time to be seen. Your carriage, polished to a near-blinding shine, pulls up outside your front steps, horses groomed to perfection, coachman standing at rigid attention in a uniform so crisp it could probably stand up on its own without him inside it. 5th Avenue at this hour isn't so much a street as it is a runway, and everyone walking it knows precisely what they're there to do. Ladies parade past in gowns wide enough to require their own personal space, hats topped with feathers tall enough to interfere with passing street lamps. Gentlemen march alongside in coats brushed to perfection, gloves spotless, canes tapping the pavement with unnecessary but stylish precision. You move at a deliberately unhurried pace, only the newly wealthy rush, after all, nodding to acquaintances with exactly the right measure of warmth, never too eager, never too cold. Storefronts along the avenue glitter with imported goods, each window display more ostentatious than the last, and you pause occasionally to admire something you have absolutely no intention of purchasing today, purely for the benefit of anyone watching. Occasionally 2 social circles collide mid-pavement, forcing an awkward little dance of pleasantries, feathered hats bobbing in unison, as both parties exchange comments about the weather while actually exchanging something considerably more pointed beneath the surface. Children, when present, are marched along in silence, dressed like miniature adults, and firmly instructed not to run, laugh too loudly, or do anything resembling actual childhood behavior in public. By the time your circuit concludes, your face aches from maintaining the same polite half-smile for the better part of an hour, and your feet throb inside shoes clearly never designed with walking in mind. Still, you return home satisfied you've been seen, you've been judged favorably, and tomorrow you'll do the entire elaborate performance again. Lunch as multi-course theater. If breakfast was elaborate, lunch is something closer to a full theatrical production. The dining table stretches the length of the room, draped in linen so crisp it could stand on its own, set with more silverware than seems reasonably necessary for a single meal. The menu, naturally, arrives in French, a language you understand just enough to nod along convincingly while having only a rough idea what you're actually about to eat. The first course is soup, consumed in careful silence, followed by a course of jellied meats that jiggles with unsettling enthusiasm, and that your hostess insists, beaming, is utterly continental. Salad arrives next, though salad undersells it considerably, a towering, almost architectural arrangement of greens and vegetables carved into decorative shapes, dressed with such theatrical flair that eating it feels vaguely disrespectful to whoever spent the better part of an hour assembling it. The main course follows roast duck, perhaps, or a delicately sauced fish, each dish accompanied by side vegetables, so precisely arranged they resemble tiny formal gardens more than actual food. Dessert arrives with genuine spectacle. A flaming pudding wheeled out with enough brandy to make everyone at the table lean back slightly, followed by cakes requiring what feels like genuine engineering expertise to slice properly without structural collapse. A fresh set of silverware accompanies each course, exchanged with a precision that borders on choreography, and getting it wrong is treated, at some tables, as a genuinely serious social lapse. Throughout it all, wine flows steadily, a different pour for each course, described in loving, extensive detail by a sommelier whose mustache alone seems to command a certain authority. By the meal's end, you feel simultaneously stuffed and strangely unsatisfied, having spent nearly 2 hours eating food you'll barely remember by dinner, purely for the privilege of doing it correctly in front of people who will absolutely notice if you don't. The nursery and the business of raising heirs. Your children, and you do have children, allegedly, though you sometimes have to remind yourself of their exact ages, live in a separate wing of the house, several floors and at least 2 long corridors removed from your own rooms. Parenthood in this world operates as a largely hands-off enterprise, delegated almost entirely to a small army of nannies, governesses, and tutors. At the top of this miniature hierarchy sits the head nanny, whose authority in the nursery rivals your own authority downstairs. Beneath her, under-nannies and nursery maids manage the daily rhythm of meals, lessons, and carefully supervised outdoor time, while a governess arrives each morning to instruct your children in French, history, and the kind of posture that apparently requires balancing a book on one's head. A typical day in the nursery runs with more discipline than most military academies. Breakfast is taken at a child-sized table, lessons follow immediately after, and outdoor time, when permitted, occurs strictly within the private garden, under close supervision, with climbing trees firmly categorized as something other children do. Your own interactions with your children tend to be brief and carefully staged. A kiss delivered to a freshly scrubbed forehead, or an appearance in the drawing room where your child recites a poem, or performs a short piece on the piano for assembled relatives who applaud politely, and quietly discuss the dangers of raising children with too much affection. Tutors arrive throughout the day for an almost comically specific range of subjects: mathematics, elocution, even fencing, on the theory that saber lessons build character, though the only thing regularly getting cut in that particular lesson is the nursery's patience. By the time your child reaches adolescence, they'll likely speak several languages and play at least one instrument fluently, while harboring a quiet, not entirely unreasonable suspicion that you are, essentially, a very well-dressed stranger who occasionally visits. Actual family time is largely ceremonial, reserved for holidays and special occasions, when children are presented briefly to the adults like small, nervous ambassadors before returning to their own separate world upstairs. It's not unkind, exactly, simply the accepted shape of parenting in a household built almost entirely around appearances. Affection in this house is measured less in time spent together and more in the sheer number of tutors employed, and the bond between parent and child is treated rather like the family silver, valued, carefully maintained, and only occasionally, briefly, actually handled.